Chapter 1. The Unexpected Challenge. Jackson had always prided himself on the quiet simplicity of his life. He was a mechanic, a craftsman, a fixer of things in a universe that seemed obsessed with discarding what was broken rather than restoring it. It wasn't glamorous, certainly not in the way the politicians, traders, and explorers were glorified in the colony, but it was enough for him. He found peace in the rhythm of his work, the satisfaction that came with turning pieces of discarded metal into something useful again. The day had begun as it always did, unremarkable and quiet. He was working in his small workshop, tucked into the back corner of a sprawling complex in New Verda, a bustling colony on the edge of the known universe, a place that thrived on trade and technological innovation. Most of the colony was filled with the hum of machines, the hustle of humans and various alien species moving about, and the occasional bickering of traders over prices. Jackson's little workshop was no exception. The clang of tools against metal, the whir of energy, the hissing of steam rising from some forgotten piece of tech, it was all part of the daily soundtrack that made up his existence. For most people in New Verda, he was just another mechanic, another face in the crowd. But for him, the work he did was important. It was everything. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the orange hues of the twilight were just beginning to fade into the cool blues of the night. Jackson was deep in the heart of a particularly tricky repair, a piece of tech that had been brought to him by a trader who claimed it was worth a fortune but couldn't get it to function properly. The device in question was some kind of alien artifact, old and twisted, almost incomprehensible in its design, with glyphs and symbols that seemed to pulse faintly when touched. It was a relic of a time long gone, a time when different species, forgotten empires, and ancient beings had once roamed the stars, leaving their traces behind. Jackson didn't care for the mystery of it. All he cared about was the craftsmanship, the mechanics, the way things fit together, and the way he could make them work. He liked the challenge. He enjoyed fixing what others deemed unfixable. The artifact hummed gently in his hands as he ran his fingers over its surface, tracing the lines of strange patterns that had once been etched into it by hands long dead. It seemed almost alive, responding to his touch in a way that made his skin tingle, but that didn't bother him. He had repaired many strange devices in his time, things that even the brightest minds had given up on. For him, the unknown was a puzzle waiting to be solved, a mystery just begging to be unraveled. He was so absorbed in his work that he barely noticed the first tremor. At first, it was a small vibration beneath his feet, the kind of subtle shake that could be attributed to the colony's engines or the movement of traffic outside. But the second tremor was stronger. His tools rattled on the bench, and a sharp hiss of steam erupted from the nearby pipes. He froze for a moment, instinctively glancing around, his mind racing to assess the cause. It wasn't a tremor from the colony's engines. This was something else, something powerful. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and a cold shiver ran down his spine as the ground seemed to shift beneath him, the vibrations building into a force that sent a low, bone-rattling hum through the walls of his workshop. Jackson stood up, wiping his hands on his overalls, and moved toward the door. His instincts, honed over years of living on the outskirts of the galaxy, told him something was wrong. He had spent enough time in places like New Verda to recognize when danger was in the air. Whatever was causing the tremors was no mere malfunction or malfunctioning tech, it was something far more immediate. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a slap to the face. The colony was still bustling around him, but there was a palpable tension in the air, something that sent every fiber of his being on high alert. The streets were crowded with people, and there was a growing murmur of unease as people began looking up into the sky. Jackson followed their gazes, his heart suddenly thudding in his chest as he saw what they were all staring at. Above them, emerging from the swirling clouds that had appeared out of nowhere, was a massive ship, its silhouette black and imposing against the dimming sky. It was unlike any vessel Jackson had ever seen. Most ships in the galaxy followed familiar designs, sleek, efficient, built for speed or cargo. But this ship, it was ancient, its hull jagged and angular, covered in symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. It looked like a relic from a bygone era, a weapon of war, or a vessel of conquest. There was no mistaking it. This ship was not here for peaceful trade or diplomatic talks. It was here for something else entirely. The ship descended slowly, and with it came the realization that New Verda, for all its isolation, was not immune to the larger forces at play in the galaxy. The ground beneath Jackson's feet shook again, this time stronger than before. People began to scatter, the chaos building as they rushed for cover. But Jackson found himself rooted to the spot, unable to move as the ship continued its descent. His pulse was racing. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something kept him in place, his eyes fixed on the ship above. Then, the ship's descent halted, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze in time. A small hatch opened on the side of the vessel, and a figure stepped out onto the ship's edge. The figure was tall and imposing, dressed in dark armor that glinted under the moonlight, a gleaming spear held in one hand. The warrior's features were hidden behind a helmet, but the aura of power and authority radiated from her like a storm ready to break. Without warning, the warrior raised her spear, her arm swinging back with the precision of a practiced fighter. The crowd gasped, and Jackson barely had time to react before the spear was launched toward him with a speed and force that would have impaled a lesser being. It was coming for him straight and true, and he could do nothing but brace himself for impact. But in that moment, something strange happened. As if guided by instinct alone, Jackson's body moved. His hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around the shaft of the spear with an ease that defied logic. He felt the metal bite into his skin as he caught the spear midair, the force of the throw reverberating through his arms, but somehow, he managed to hold firm. The crowd fell silent. The warrior on the ship was motionless, her eyes hidden behind the reflective surface of her helmet, but there was a palpable tension between them. Jackson stood there, breathless, his fingers still wrapped around the spear as the energy in the air seemed to shift. The warrior's voice boomed across the clearing, her tone thick with authority. "By ancient law," she declared, her words carrying the weight of something far older than any living memory. "You have claimed me as yours. You, who dared to catch the spear, are now bound to me by the sacred vows of our people. You are my partner, my protector, and I am yours forever." Jackson's mind spun as the reality of the situation began to sink in. He had been caught in something far beyond his understanding, far beyond his control. The warrior, the alien warrior, was now bound to him, not as a servant, not as a prize, but as something else entirely. The laws of her people, ancient and powerful, had been invoked, and there was no way to undo what had just happened. He looked up at the warrior, his heart still racing, his mind trying to make sense of it all. But before he could speak, the warrior began to descend from the ship, the ground beneath her feet crackling with energy. She moved with the grace and power of a predator, her eyes fixed on Jackson as she approached him. "You have caught the spear," she said again, her voice softer now, yet no less commanding. "And by the laws of my people, you are mine. We are now bound together. Forever." Jackson stood there, frozen, still gripping the spear, his thoughts racing. This was not a turn he had expected his life to take, not in a million years. And yet, the universe had a way of throwing the impossible at you when you least expected it. And in this case, the impossible had caught him. Jackson stood in stunned silence, still holding the spear that had been thrown at him with such terrifying speed and force. His hand burned with the effort it took to catch it, the metal biting into his skin, but his mind was whirling far beyond the physical pain. The air around him was charged with an energy he couldn't quite explain. His heart pounded in his chest, a combination of adrenaline and shock coursing through him as the realization hit. He had just been thrust into a situation that was bigger than anything he could have imagined. The alien warrior was still on the edge of her ship, the darkness of her armor making her silhouette almost imperceptible against the blackness of the night sky. The crowd around Jackson had fallen completely silent, everyone frozen in place as they too tried to process what had just happened. They were watching a man, someone they knew, someone they'd seen as an ordinary mechanic, hold the weapon that had been hurled at him by an extraterrestrial, armed warrior. And in that instant, Jackson realized that his life was no longer ordinary. The alien warrior, her figure outlined by the dim glow of her ship's lights, raised her helmeted head, and her voice rang out across the square, powerful and unyielding. "By ancient law," she announced, her words carrying a weight of authority that sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. "You have caught the spear. In doing so, You have claimed my honor, and by the sacred laws of my people, you are now bound to me forever." Jackson's mind tried to catch up with the implications of her words, but he couldn't make sense of it. He had caught her spear, yes, but what did it mean? He had no knowledge of ancient alien customs or warrior codes. He didn't even know if he had caught it by accident or skill. Was this some kind of test? A challenge? Or had he just become part of something far more dangerous than he could comprehend? The warrior stepped down from her ship, her boots making a soft thud as they landed on the ground, sending a vibration through the earth beneath Jackson's feet. Her movements were fluid, precise, the grace of someone who had spent her life in battle. Despite her imposing figure and the sharp gleam of her weapon still clasped in her hand, there was a strange, almost magnetic presence about her. Her gaze, hidden behind the sleek visor of her helmet, never left Jackson. "Tell me, human," she spoke again, the tone of her voice unwavering. "Do you accept the law of my people, or do you challenge it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with finality. Jackson had no idea what he was supposed to say. He had never been one for heroics or leadership, and now, it seemed the universe had chosen him for something far greater than he could have ever imagined. The weight of her question settled deep within his chest, making his lungs feel tight as he struggled to breathe. I don't know what you mean," he finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. He swallowed, trying to make sense of the situation. "I don't know your laws. I just caught the spear. That's all." The warrior's lips twitched slightly, as though amused by his uncertainty. She took a step closer to him, her figure towering over him as she spoke again, her voice softened but still carrying the unyielding weight of authority. "By the traditions of my people, those who are worthy of catching the spear are bound to us in a pact. You are now my partner in life, in battle, in honor. And so, I am yours. It is the law." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. Wait, what do you mean, partner? I'm not asking for any kind of pact. I just did what anyone would have done. I saved myself, that's all." The warrior tilted her head, as if studying him more intently. "You misunderstand. The law does not care for your intentions. It cares for the act itself. You have been marked. We are now bound by fate. Your life, now entwined with mine, is no longer your own." Jackson's mind reeled. He was trying to process what she was saying, but it was as if everything he understood about the world was being upended. He didn't understand the alien customs, the laws that seemed so ancient, so foreign. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. He had just become a part of something much larger than himself. Something he couldn't undo. And whether he liked it or not, this alien warrior, this fierce, imposing figure, was now inextricably tied to him. The crowd that had gathered around him seemed to exhale in unison, their murmurs growing louder as the realization of what had just occurred rippled through them. Jackson could feel their eyes on him, but he couldn't focus on them. He couldn't focus on anything except the alien warrior before him, standing tall and unmoving, the spear still gleaming in her hands, her gaze still fixed upon him. Jackson finally found his voice again, though it sounded small, uncertain. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't know what I was doing. I just dash." "You are not alone in this," the warrior interrupted, her voice low and firm. "You may not have sought this fate, but it is now yours. And there is no escape from it. The law binds us, human. I am now yours to command, and you are mine." Jackson shook his head, still in disbelief. "This can't be real. You're telling me that just because I caught a spear because I didn't die when you threw it, I am suddenly tied to you? Forever?" The warrior nodded, the movement almost imperceptible beneath the dark, imposing helmet. "That is the law of my people, and it is a law that cannot be broken." As the reality of her words set in, Jackson's thoughts raced. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. He was bound to this alien warrior by something far older, far more significant than he could fathom. And now, by the ancient law of her people, his life was no longer his own. "I don't know what to say," Jackson murmured, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. "You do not need to speak," the warrior said, her voice softer now, yet still carrying an undeniable strength. "Your actions have already spoken for you. The law has been fulfilled." Jackson's stomach turned as he processed what had just happened. The alien warrior had thrown a spear at him. And now, because he had caught it by skill, luck, or some strange twist of fate, he was bound to her, not just for a moment, but forever. His heart hammered in his chest, and a cold chill ran through him. There was no turning back now. The warrior stepped forward, her eyes fixed on him. From this moment forward, you are my partner, Jackson of Earth. By the laws of my people, I am yours, and you are mine. As she spoke those words, the air between them seemed to shift, thickening with a new kind of energy, one Jackson couldn't explain but felt to his very core. His life, the one he had carefully built, was now gone. This was his fate. Chapter 2, The Bond. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Jackson stood there, his chest rising and falling rapidly, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just transpired. He was bound to her. His fate, his life, everything had just become irrevocably intertwined with the alien warrior before him, and there was no undoing it. He had no idea what he was supposed to do next, how he was supposed to live with this new reality. The warrior stood there, watching him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as though every thought in his mind was laid bare for her to read. Her presence, so powerful and commanding, seemed to press in on him from every direction. It was impossible to escape the feeling that this moment, this strange, surreal encounter was a turning point in his life. Nothing would be the same again. Jackson swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. I don't know what this means for me. Or for you. He finally managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. I'm not even sure how to process it. One moment, I'm just trying to survive, and the next this happens. The warrior took a slow step forward, and her movements, graceful yet deliberate, seemed to quiet the air around them. You are not alone in this, she said softly, the words almost a reassurance. Though you may not understand, your actions were significant. By catching the spear, you have proven your worth. The bond we share is ancient, but it is not one of servitude. It is one of partnership, of mutual respect. Jackson looked at her, confusion still clouding his thoughts. He didn't know what kind of partnership this was, what kind of responsibilities it came with. And frankly, he wasn't sure he was ready for any of it. He had never asked for this. He had never asked for anything more than a quiet, uneventful life. But now, fate had thrown him into a situation that he could barely grasp. Partnership? Jackson echoed. I don't know if I can live up to whatever this is supposed to be. I'm just a mechanic. A guy who fixes things. How does someone like me fit into your world? The warrior's gaze softened, though her stance remained as commanding as ever. It is not about what you have done in the past, Jackson, she said, her voice steady and patient. It is about what you will do now. We are bound together by the law of my people, yes. But more than that, we are bound by the choices we make from here on out. The world you knew is gone, and the path before us will not be easy. But you will not walk it alone. Jackson closed his eyes for a moment, trying to absorb her words, to find some shred of understanding in the sea of uncertainty that had engulfed him. He could still hear the faint hum of the alien ship above them, the faint sounds of a crowd murmuring in the distance, still processing the scene they had witnessed. The world, his world, had been irrevocably altered, and he couldn't help but wonder what this strange bond meant for his future, for his freedom, and for his very identity. The warrior seemed to sense his hesitation. She stepped closer to him, her voice lowering, yet still strong. I do not expect you to know what this means yet. No one would. But know this: our bond is not one-sided. You are my partner, and in that, you hold power. The laws of my people bind me to you. Yes, but they also grant you the strength to stand beside me in all things. Jackson turned to look at her, his mind still racing. What do you mean, power? He asked, the word hanging in the air with an unfamiliar weight. Her eyes gleamed with something akin to respect, or perhaps understanding. The power to make decisions. The power to command as much as you follow. You are no servant, Jackson. You are my equal in this, bound by the ancient law. For a moment, Jackson didn't know how to respond. The reality of what she said was slowly dawning on him. He wasn't just a pawn in this ancient game of law and power. He was now a player, whether he liked it or not. He had been thrust into this world of power, politics, and ancient customs, and somehow, it was his responsibility to navigate it. He didn't feel ready. He didn't feel qualified. But he knew that there was no going back now. Before he could speak again, the warrior reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm, her touch surprisingly warm. The first step, she said, her voice soft but firm, is accepting that we are bound by this. Together. From this moment forward, we are a force, and we must move forward, no matter the cost." Jackson swallowed hard and nodded, though the weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't escape it. This was his reality now, and if he was to survive it, he would need to adapt. He would need to learn to fight for this bond, for this partnership, and for whatever the universe had planned for them both. Chapter 3. Into the heart of the warrior's world. The days that followed were a blur of uncertainty and preparation. Jackson's life had been upended in an instant, and now, every day brought new challenges, new revelations. The alien warrior, whom he now knew as Zara, took him under her wing, teaching him the ways of her people and the ancient laws that bound them together. But the more she taught him, the more questions he had. He learned that her species, the Zari, were an ancient and warrior-driven race, known throughout the galaxy for their honor, strength, and fearlessness in battle. They had once ruled over vast expanses of territory, but their empire had crumbled, their influence waning as new powers rose to challenge them. Zara, it seemed, was one of the last of her kind, an elite warrior bound by duty, honor, and the ancient traditions of her people. She had been sent to New Verda on a mission to reclaim a lost artifact, something of immense power that could tip the balance of power in the galaxy. But now, with Jackson unexpectedly tied to her, her mission was in jeopardy. For reasons unknown to him, the laws of her people had decreed that he was now her partner, her equal, and the bond they shared was sacred. Yet, this bond came with consequences. Every day, Zara trained him. She taught him the art of combat, the strategies of the Zari, and the subtleties of their diplomacy. But no matter how much she taught him, Jackson felt out of place. He wasn't a warrior. He wasn't someone who belonged to this world. He was just a mechanic, a man who knew how to fix things, not how to fight or lead. But Zara's presence, her confidence and strength, gave him a strange sense of purpose. He might not understand the laws, the politics, or the true weight of the responsibility now thrust upon him, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let her down. The training was grueling. Zara pushed him harder than he thought possible, forcing him to confront his own limitations, to rise above his fear and uncertainty. But she never showed him mercy. She expected him to learn, to adapt, to rise to the challenge. There were moments when Jackson thought he couldn't do it, when the pressure felt too great, and he felt the weight of this new life pressing down on him like a crushing force. But Zara, unwavering in her discipline, always reminded him that there was no turning back. He had caught the spear, and now they were bound. One evening, after another grueling session of training, Zara led him outside to a small, secluded platform that overlooked the city of New Verda. The lights of the colony below flickered like a sea of stars. Zara stood beside him, her posture as regal as ever, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We must go to the heart of the galaxy," she said quietly, her voice steady but filled with a deep, underlying intensity. "The artifact we seek is not far from here, but there are others who would stop at nothing to claim it. They will test our bond, our resolve. But we must move forward, for both of our futures." Jackson turned to face her, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. This wasn't just about the artifact or the ancient laws. This was about survival, about standing by her side, fighting not just for their bond, but for the future that awaited them. And so, with that, the next phase of their journey began. Together, bound by an ancient law, they would face the unknown challenges that awaited them. And Jackson would learn that sometimes, fate had a way of leading you to exactly where you needed to be, even if it was nowhere near where you thought you'd end up. Jackson had thought he understood pressure, the feeling of needing to meet deadlines or keep clients satisfied, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of the life that now pressed upon him. He had only just begun to scratch the surface of what being bound to Zara truly meant, and already, the magnitude of it was overwhelming. Every day brought a new challenge, a new lesson, a new set of expectations he didn't know how to meet. Zara, ever vigilant, was always there to push him, to remind him of the stakes. She was unyielding in her discipline, and in many ways, Jackson respected that. She expected nothing less than his best, and though he wasn't a warrior by nature, she was determined to make him one. He had to fight to survive in this alien world, to navigate the tangled web of politics, power, and destiny that now bound them together. Over the next few weeks, Jackson trained relentlessly under Zara's watchful eye. She taught him the ancient ways of her people, the art of combat, of strategy, of diplomacy. He was learning the history of the Zari, the ancient race to which Zara belonged. They had once ruled vast star systems, their empire spanning the galaxy. But that empire had long since crumbled, brought low by their enemies and their own hubris. Zara, as one of the last remaining warriors, carried the weight of her people's legacy on her shoulders. But with that legacy came a dangerous burden. Zara's mission to recover the lost artifact was more than just a quest for power. It was a race against time, a battle against enemies who would stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. And now, with Jackson bound to her, it was no longer just her mission, it was theirs. Whatever was at stake, whatever the price, they would face it together. The Zari had ancient laws that bound their warriors to their partners. Jackson, having caught the spear, had been tied to Zara in a bond that was both a blessing and a curse. He was her equal now, her protector and partner in all things. He had come to understand that much, but what he hadn't fully realized was the depth of that connection. It wasn't just about fighting side by side, it was about trust, loyalty, and a shared fate that neither of them could escape. One night, as they stood together on the edge of the platform overlooking New Verda, Zara spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of everything they had learned, everything they had yet to face. "We go to the heart of the galaxy tomorrow," she said, her tone steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "The artifact lies deep within the ancient ruins of a long-forgotten civilization. But we are not the only ones seeking it. There are others, factions who want it for themselves, factions that will stop at nothing to destroy us if we stand in their way." Jackson nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the weeks of training, the grueling exercises, and the lessons about the Zari's enemies. He had never been more out of his depth. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, there was a strange sense of determination that had taken root in him. He couldn't walk away. This bond, this partnership, had become a part of him. He had accepted it, whether he was ready or not. "I'm with you," he said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "I'll fight. I'll stand by your side. Whatever it takes." Zara's gaze softened ever so slightly, a brief flicker of warmth passing through her eyes. It was a look he hadn't seen often, and it made something stir within him. Perhaps, despite her fierce nature, despite the strength she exuded, she needed him just as much as he needed her. Their fates were now tied, and they would face whatever challenges came together. "We must be strong," she said, her tone resolute. "We will succeed, or we will die trying. There is no other way." Jackson met her gaze, a surge of emotion welling up inside him. It wasn't just the fear of what lay ahead, it was the realization that this was his life now. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He wasn't just a guy who worked with machines. He was part of something much bigger. And though he had no idea where this journey would lead, he knew one thing for certain. He was in it, fully and completely, for better or worse. Chapter 4: The Price of Loyalty. The journey to the heart of the galaxy was nothing like Jackson had imagined. The closer they got to their destination, the more the tension between them grew. Zara's stoic resolve never wavered, but Jackson could see the underlying strain in her eyes. The weight of her people's history, the responsibility she carried as one of the last Zari warriors, was never far from her thoughts. But she did not show it. She was a warrior, a leader, and she carried herself with the grace and authority of one who had seen countless battles. As they entered the ruins, the landscape shifted, and Jackson could feel the power of the ancient site pulsing around them. The place was more than just old, it was alive with energy, a force that seemed to reverberate through the air. The artifact they sought was buried deep within these ruins, a relic of a civilization that had vanished long before the Zari had risen to power. The secrets it held were worth more than anything they had ever encountered, and its power could change the course of the galaxy forever. But they were not alone. As they made their way deeper into the ruins, Jackson could feel the presence of others, lurking in the shadows. The Zari's enemies, the factions that sought the artifact for themselves, were closing in. It was only a matter of time before they would clash. The stakes had never been higher. Zara's voice broke the silence. "Stay close," she commanded, her tone sharp. "We cannot afford to be caught off guard." Jackson nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had trained for this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the intensity of what was about to unfold. The deeper they went into the ruins, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in on them, and every step echoed in the eerie silence. It felt as though the very air was charged with the weight of centuries, and Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that they were not just exploring ruins, they were entering a tomb, a place where ancient powers still held sway. Finally, they reached the central chamber, where the artifact was said to be hidden. But as they entered, Jackson's heart sank. Standing at the far end of the room, cloaked in shadow, was a figure. Tall, menacing, and covered in dark armor that gleamed like obsidian, the figure stepped forward, drawing a weapon that seemed to hum with energy. "We've been waiting for you." The figure's voice was cold, devoid of emotion, but unmistakably threatening. Zara's stance shifted immediately, her body moving into a defensive position. "I should have known," she murmured, her eyes narrowing. The Corrin. Always lurking, always waiting. The Corrin were a powerful, ruthless faction, enemies of the Zari and many other races. They were known for their mastery of dark technologies and their insatiable hunger for control. The figure before them was one of their commanders, a dangerous opponent who would stop at nothing to take the artifact and use it to further the Corrin's goals. Zara turned to Jackson, her gaze steady and determined. "You stay with me. We fight together. You are not just my partner in name, Jackson. You are my partner in this battle. You will fight with me, or we will lose everything." Jackson didn't hesitate. He nodded firmly, his heart steadying with her words. He had come this far. He had been bound to her by ancient law, and now, that bond was the very thing that would give him the strength to face whatever came next. The battle that followed was fierce. The Corrin commander was a formidable opponent, his movements fast and deadly, but Zara's skill and precision matched him at every turn. Jackson fought alongside her, his instincts now sharpened by the training he had endured. The spear that had once bound them together was now a weapon of destruction in their hands, and they fought with a synchrony that felt almost natural. But despite their strength, the Corrin were relentless. The battle raged on, and just when it seemed as though they might be overwhelmed, Jackson felt something stir within him. The power of the ancient bond between him and Zara surged through him, and with a final, decisive move, they managed to bring the commander down. The Corrin commander collapsed, his weapon slipping from his hand as he crumpled to the ground. Jackson stood over him, panting, his chest heaving with exertion. His body ached, but his heart surged with something else, a sense of triumph, of purpose, of unity. He had fought, and together, they had won. Zara stood beside him, her expression unreadable, but her posture unwavering. "We have succeeded," she said, her voice steady. "The artifact is ours." Jackson looked at her, his heart still racing from the battle, but now filled with something deeper. He had come into this world unsure of his place, unsure of what the future held. But now, as they stood together in the ruins, surrounded by the weight of their victory, he understood. This bond, this partnership, wasn't just about ancient laws or old customs. It was about trust, loyalty, and the strength they found in each other. And as they prepared to leave the ruins, the weight of the galaxy no longer felt so overwhelming. Because now, they were not just bound by law. They were bound by something much stronger, something that would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead.